Hey, it's Rocky. Welcome to Richer Soul. Today's guest is Claudette Rowley, who's going to talk to us about creating cultural brilliance and why that's important. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Imagine it's 12 months from now, and you've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, excited about the day? To have great relationships and friends who support you and propel you forward? How does it feel to have an excess of money, to be able to make the choices you want? To be fearless and open to trying new adventures? Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time, and your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. Welcome to Richer Soul, where we achieve our dreams and bring balance to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. If you have not had a chance to listen to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create the life of your dreams. You can also find all the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. While you're there, you can sign up for a monthly email where I share the best articles I read this month, let you know about upcoming episodes, and share a little wisdom. You can also listen to coaching calls under the Coaching Calls tab. I also share the most interesting articles I read every week on Facebook at facebook.com/Richer Soul. And there's also a Facebook group where you can ask questions and interact with other listeners. Today's quote is from Isaac Asimov. Things do change. The only question is that since things are deteriorating so quickly, will society and man's habits change quickly enough? We're going to talk about change today, and our theme is relationships. In companies, these two go hand in hand, as you have to have great relationships and culture that will allow for change. Some companies refuse to change, and now their leadership position is gone, and in some cases, the companies are gone. Blockbuster is a classic example. They had the culture of hammering people for late fees. At the height of their dominance, they collected $800 million in late fees in a single year. No wonder some people struggled to make ends meet. That created bad feelings by its customers. And when an alternative came along, like Netflix, many people switched. Blockbuster had the chance to buy Netflix, but they didn't. Netflix has continued to evolve and even to reinvent itself again into a streaming company and now into a production company. It's the ability to see the future, change, and evolve that will allow you to succeed in an ever-changing world. In today's episode, we talk about culture as it relates to companies. However, these principles apply to all areas of your life. Your family culture, the culture of the groups you belong to, and your culture at work. When I coached varsity soccer, I spent a lot of time teaching and creating the culture of the team. It was amazing to see how changing the culture and creating new beliefs could take the same group of kids from the bottom of the rankings to the top of the rankings over time. We spent time at every practice to discuss culture, model culture, and to make it a natural part of what we did. The results were amazing. So wherever you are, today's information will help you change the culture around you. Today's guest is Claudette Rowley, the Cultural Brilliance CEO. She is a change management consultant, cultural designer, and executive coach. She is passionate about helping leaders and organizations resolve complex organizational problems in ways that honor the intelligence of their cultural systems and the brilliance of their people. For almost 20 years, Rowley has consulted, trained, and coached executive leaders and teams at Fortune 500 companies, small businesses, higher education, and startups to create proactive and innovative workplace cultures that deliver outstanding results throughout all the areas of the organization. With a client list that includes Medtronic, Boston University Law, and MIT, Rowley's unique programs solve complicated problems, create buy-in and engagement, and receive high reviews. She's the creator of the Cultural Brilliance System and hosts a globally syndicated radio show. She also teaches a course on cultural and communication at Northwestern University and is author of the book Cultural Brilliance, the DNA of Organizational Excellence, a step-by-step guide to activating the greatness in your organization. Let's meet our guest and learn more about organizational excellence and behavior. Welcome to Richer Soul, Claudette. It's great to have you join us today.
Oh, thanks so much, Rocky. I'm really glad to be here.
And I'm excited to have you join us today and to learn a little bit about your brilliance.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, look forward to our discussion.
So let's start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
I would say school. What comes to mind when you ask that is a memory I haven't had for a really long time, which was being in second grade and being taught how to count money with little cardboard nickels, dimes, and quarters and pennies. That's interesting. That's probably the extent of what we learned about money in school, was how to count it. And then in my family, we also didn't learn very much about money. It was nothing overt. It was really much more observing my parents, how they handled money. And what I figured out in my 20s was a lot more about how to handle money. That some of the things I'd observed growing up really weren't the best ways to manage money, to save money, to be strategic about it. So I actually ended up learning much more about money in my 20s and 30s.
So did you do something in particular to learn in your 20s and 30s?
Yeah.
What was it that you did?
My husband was actually very good with money, so I learned a lot from him, just seeing how he managed it. Good practices like you always pay your credit card off every month, which was not something I observed growing up, for example, is you want to be as debt-free as possible. So a lot of his principles around money. And then in my 30s, I started my own business, which is now a consulting business, but it started out as a coaching business. And I struggled with the financial part of the business, not in terms of invoicing or anything like that, but having to really overcome some of my own limitations around money. So I hired a money coach who helped me a lot with the beliefs that were holding me back related to money. So I worked with her, and that was really transformational.
And it is. And it's surprising you say that, because not a lot of people have hired money coaches. It seems to be coming more and more so. But when you do start a business, there are a lot of beliefs, and most of them are probably formed in childhood, that prevent us from the success that we can have. And once we overcome ourselves and those limiting beliefs, everything kind of opens up.
Yeah, it made a huge difference, right? It really, really did. How I was limiting myself and what I thought I was capable of, just in finance. I thought I was capable of a ton in every other aspect of the business, but the financial piece, she would talk about money is a form of energy, right? It's a form of self-esteem. And it was fascinating to think about money like that and learn about it that way and overcome those obstacles. And of course, I'm happy to say they are no longer obstacles to my ability to earn money.
I'm glad to hear that. So the obstacles, do you know where they originally came from?
Yeah, definitely childhood, for sure. There was a lot of scarcity mentality. Like my mother would talk about, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough money. And she would use that as a reason to not do things often. And they didn't have an unlimited amount of money by any means, but our basic needs were covered. We always could eat. We always had a nice house, things like that. So the basics were taken care of. Yeah, so it was a lot around this tightness around money, scarcity. There's never going to be enough money. So for me, money had this tightness around it. And it was very stressful because it just hearing these same ideas repeated over and over again throughout my childhood.
And I think that's typical for most people. I mean, that's kind of the way we grew up. And
yeah,
most people don't have an abundance of money. And so those are the words that are used. And I don't think our parents realize how those words kind of stick with us over the decades. And I think nowadays there's a lot more research out there and a lot of good books that talk even specifically to parents about how to watch the words you use with your kids and how to change your phraseology so that you don't create these limiting beliefs that then hold you back later in life.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I have a son who's 16, and I have been really careful, even when there were times, certainly when he was younger, when admittedly there wasn't a tremendous amount of money. I was careful to not talk about it like you were saying, right? to get into talking about we don't have enough money or we can't do this or we can't do that for that reason. And what I've noticed is he saves money, he buys things that he wants, but it doesn't burn a hole in his pocket. And I'll be interested to see as an adult how he handles it. And it may be because he didn't grow up around a lot of that scarcity thinking, he doesn't view it as something he either needs to spend right away because it's something he'll run out of, or he doesn't need to be overly frugal about it either. He's just really relaxed about it. If he wants something, he gets it and he saves the rest. It's actually nice to see.
That is awesome. There are kids who do it and there are kids who aren't. And unfortunately, culture, which we're going to talk a lot more about, is something that the kids are all judging each other sometimes based on clothes or what they have or the material things versus their inner self. And so it kind of messes with that whole area as well.
That's true. I remember that as a teenager, how he's not as tuned into some of that, but I remember it just because of his personality. But I remember as a teenager, like you said, about really wanting, a certain pair of jeans, right? And my mother said, if you can earn the money, you can get them, but I'm not spending $50 on jeans, right? Which is a lot of money at that time. Definitely.
It's still a lot of money today to spend $50 on jeans.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So it was definitely a lot in 1980, whatever.
It was. Were those the Jordache jeans? I remember those.
They were actually the Guess jeans.
The Guess jeans. Yes. Okay. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is culture. And I guess we're going to take this a little out of order, but as you deal with people and companies, do you see limiting beliefs in them that prevent them from having success in whatever business they're in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do. And in the work that I do, we tend to call them mindsets, but it's a limiting belief, right? Or it's an opening belief. A mindset can be positive too. But yeah, exactly what you're talking about, that a classic example is nothing will ever change around here. And so we know, well, what happens then is the person is closed off mentally to seeing the possibilities, to see the fact that something might be changing, even a little bit, right? Even a 5% change matters. Or the limiting beliefs that form in a culture, right? In individuals, but also in a larger culture. Like the most important thing we should do is put out fires every day or some version thereof. So the organization never gets to any sort of strategic problem solving is another common example.
Do people really do that? Spend their whole day putting out fires?
Metaphorically, yes.
Wow.
So there'll be that kind of firefighting problem solving where the next crisis, the next crisis, the next crisis, and they're just putting it out. That's the way the culture operates, right? And they have to do business. Maybe they're trying to ship a product, right? Something like that, and get it out the door to a customer. And it's hard for them to get out of that cycle. And often I'm assisting with that. But to get out of that cycle and say, first of all, your stress level must be through the roof. There are occasional people who really are energized by that kind of crisis-related work, but most people are stressed by it. And then they need to learn how to step back and say, how do we solve these problems so they don't happen again? Because these are almost always repetitive problems. How do we get strategic? What do you need to change in your process? How do we need to look at this whole system differently? So it's a complete change of belief system.
And that sounds appropriate. So what are some of the bigger cultural trends that you are seeing currently in business?
Cultural trends, a big one is, there are several big ones. One is diversity and inclusion, which I think we're hearing a tremendous amount about. What are environments where people feel safe and comfortable? Are we inclusive? Do we have enough of diversity? Are we allowing that? That's a big one. Another one I'm hearing a lot about is, we see a lot in the news, is artificial intelligence, right? And how that's going to change organizations, change culture, change people. Another one I see is trust. I think trust and respect and having dignity in the workplace is a huge issue. It may not be reported about on as much, in the news and things like that, but it's a huge issue. What I see is that many people are not putting up anymore with cultures or organizations, companies that won't treat them well. They don't treat them with respect and dignity. And they're saying, you know what? This just doesn't work anymore. We're human beings. We deserve to be treated as human beings in a respectful way. The other cultural trend I'm seeing a lot of is, and we hear a lot of this millennial workforce, right? That generation of wanting to work in great cultures, wanting to do work that they find exciting and energizing and matches their skills and talents and strengths. So it's almost like there's a subset of people, and hopefully that subset's growing larger and larger, who are saying, we want better cultures, we want to be respected, we want to be part of something that's purpose-driven where we can really make a difference and we can use it or contribute. We can contribute through making this difference.
And I'm seeing some of those same things as well. It's funny, I was just at a breakfast meeting and the topic of the meeting was company culture. And there was a company there that has a pretty good culture. And they talked about how they built their culture and some of the steps that they went through. And one of the funny things was, and he asked the question, he goes, because we did this and we struggled with it. He said, we're all sitting there in the room and all the words for our values are up on the wall. And we had people turn around and look the other way and say, how many of you can name the values on the wall? I know in many of the places I've been, most people have no idea what they are and or how to implement them or how they're even implemented within the organization. Unfortunately, I guess at some point it was created, but nobody decided to follow that. Is that normal? Is that abnormal?
I think that's pretty normal. And in organizations, when I'm working with an organization on a culture change, right, of course, we're moving away from that. And that's a really fascinating exercise that you just described, to have people turn around and do you know the values? And even if people could recite the values, right, correctly, there's a big difference, as we know, between knowing the values and you were just saying this, and behaving, right? What are the behavioral descriptors of each value? And I think that's a really important piece. And that's also unusual, when a company goes to that length. But when they do, it makes a big difference, to really describe and define how you're going to live out the values.
And they kind of take it a step further is, are we demonstrating the values from a leadership standpoint in our employees, demonstrating the values? And I think one of the things that they talk about is when they bring people in who are new to the company, they go through a strict hiring process. They're more interested in finding people who will fit their culture than in the talent that they bring. Because they said, we can always train people, but we can't train the cultural side as much. And I don't know if that's what you find.
Yeah, I would agree. In fact, I'm doing a pretty deep culture transformation project with a company, and I've helped with some of the hiring for that particular reason you were just talking about. And really, their industry is, you do have to have, some of the skills, certainly, but we really have interviewed for culture. We've really looked at, is this person, especially since the company was in transition, is this person going to help continue to elevate the culture, right? Are they actually going to bring something in that will take it even further? Are we sure they're as sure as one can be, right? Aligned with what the company is really, really looking for. And I think that makes a tremendous difference, because it is really, if you hire someone and they're not a match for the culture, they're not likely to stay, or you're more likely to part ways with them.
And that's true. And it's better off to make the right decision up front than to continue to pay for the price for months and years down the line.
Literally pay the price, right? Because that's expensive financially.
It is very expensive, not to mention that it's amazing how much one person can bring about change in both directions. And so it can go beyond just the person you put there.
Yeah, it is amazing how much power one person has.
So you wrote a book. It's called Cultural Brilliance, the DNA of Organizational Excellence. What inspired you to write the book?
I wrote the book because I was interested. So as a consultant, like many consultants, right, I love to solve problems. And I'd been working in organizations as a consultant for about 19 years, almost 20 years. And one thing I noticed is, even when we weren't officially talking about culture, we were, of course, always talking about culture, almost always. And I really wanted to be overt about it. And I viewed culture, it's like this, it's a very interesting unsolved problem in a way. Like, how do we transition a culture in a way that really sticks, that takes it to another level, that can make it brilliant? And so I was inspired to come up with a system and process that I developed. And then I used to be a social worker, so I have a very strong, contribute, change the world kind of side to me. So I figured a book was really one of the best ways to get these ideas out into the world, right? I can only work with so many organizations at a time. And I really wanted to send these ideas out so that people who resonated with them could benefit from them and use them. Because one thing I see in organizations, and I'm sure you do too, is there's so much potential left in the form of culture that's just not even used. Individual people whose talents aren't used effectively, the overall organizational system. You see, this could be improved, that could be changed. The culture could bring so much more into the organization. And often companies and leaders just don't know how to do it. They don't know how to make the changes. So I wanted to offer something that could really help companies create the culture they were meant to have.
And I've noticed working within organizations that the difference between good and bad, or even good and great, is not this big, vast divide. It's a very small difference. If we just made some very small changes, we could dramatically shift everything. It doesn't require massive differences in the way we behave. Is that what you've seen, or am I just too optimistic?
I'm an optimist too. What I've seen is it ranges. I've seen, like the company I was mentioning, we did do a lot of really deep work and make some really big changes. We did it very much in alignment with everyone in the company. So my work is very inclusive. So we're going to involve as many people as possible. It's not just with the leadership. So it was everyone coming together and assessing and designing and identifying what needed to shift. And I would say it's not so much that the changes themselves are dramatic. It's more that they were hard for the folks to make in the company, had been used to operating one way for a really long time. I can also think of other examples, to your point, where the changes could be fairly minor. If everybody got on board and they were open-minded, had their minds open to trying to do something different. But I find if it's about something like, communicating differently, making decisions differently, being more of an owner in an organization, things like that, some of those changes, while seemingly fairly minor on a behavioral level, for some folks, it's interesting how challenging it is. And these are really smart people, right? It's just that it's hard for them to change their behavior.
It is. We started here, right, with mindsets, and that's what you're kind of coming back to. There are certain behaviors. We all behave a certain way. We all look at life through a certain lens. The growth comes when we can learn to shift the lenses that we look at life through, and when we have that open mindset to look at things from other points of view. So I think that is a big part of it. So what makes a culture brilliant?
I think of brilliant cultures in a couple of different ways. One is that it's a culture that has a lot of a term that's a little bit newer called psychological safety. It's actually been around for a while, but we just started hearing in the last couple of years a lot more, in our everyday language and organizations. And it really means simply that an organization or team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. So I can share an unpopular opinion. I can share a different idea. I can make a mistake and fess up, right, in the name of learning from it, or our whole team can learn from it. So I'm not going to be worried if I do any of those things that there's retribution, that I'll be passed over for promotion, that people will talk behind my back, things like that. So brilliant cultures have that kind of trust, where people can feel psychologically safe, which doesn't mean they're not going to get constructive feedback, which doesn't mean they're not being held accountable. It simply means that they're not concerned about something negative happening. And what we find in psychologically safe cultures and organizations is that we have more innovation, problems are solved more effectively, and we see that in brilliant cultures. So in those brilliant cultures, I call it, when I see it start to shift in that way, I'll notice that the light comes back on in people's eyes. And I've literally seen, like, someone who just seemed downtrodden at work, all of a sudden is brighter. Someone who never spoke up in a meeting is speaking up, right? There's like the life comes back in, and there's a different vibe and energy in the organization. Another way I define brilliant cultures is that they're systems, organizational systems, that proactively respond to change in ways that decrease stress, inspire learning, and promote organizational health and success. And I gave them this definition because one thing I noticed is when an organization, and we see these systems in nature as well, when any system, organizational or nature, any other kind of system, can adapt to change fairly easily, they tended to not only survive but thrive. And what we know in a lot of organizations is that change is something, change, it's negative, it's draining, right? It bottlenecks things, it causes problems. And I thought, what if an organization could design a culture that could adapt to change really differently in a way that actually accelerated its success, its learning, and decreased its stress? And so that's another way that I think about brilliant cultures as a new paradigm for organizations.
And I think that's becoming even more important today because the world is changing and it's changing super quickly. And if you do not change with it and your company does not change with it, you're going to be left behind. And I think a classic example of that is Blockbuster. You know, they were offered the opportunity to buy Netflix. They were offered the opportunity to change the way they did business. And they decided to stay in their tried and true model. And within no time, they were no longer in business.
It's a great example, isn't it?
It is.
And it was interesting. So I remember going to Blockbuster and then just to see Blockbuster and all these other video stores, even the independent ones, disappear, right? Because something else came along that as a society and a culture, we liked better, right? I find that when organizations, I'm going to make a very general statement here, but when organizations stick their head in the sand, so to speak, it really does, especially now, it really doesn't go well, right? There needs to be an awareness of what's happening in the organization and outside of it so that a company can adapt to change and really can be responsive in a way that doesn't cause them so much stress.
So when you're looking at your company, how do you evaluate culture? What's the best way to get your baseline?
Yeah, the baseline is I do a fair amount of assessment work in an organization. One of the things I say is we really can't change what we don't understand, or we can, but we're going to make a big mess, which is what we see some companies do, unfortunately. Oh, we know all about our culture. We'll just do A, B, and C, and it'll be good, right? They really didn't know that much about it. And so it often makes things worse. But we'll do assessing, I like being what I call a cultural detective. So how do we really stand outside of the organization and the culture and look at it very, very, very objectively without judgment? So interviewing people, observing, meetings and other sorts of events or processes. I use an assessment often called Culture Talk, which is a really interesting assessment. It looks at culture through the lens of archetypes, right? And so it helps people understand some of their cultural patterns of behavior and get a company engaged in a really great conversation around their culture. And again, in a non-judgmental way. I'll often do a half-day facilitated assessment that helps a company understand some of its underlying cultural beliefs. And these are usually, they're called underlying because it's something, they're usually beliefs an organization is not entirely aware of or aware of at all. So we gather information through these, different ways, and then I really synthesize it, and we'll start looking at what are the different mindsets that are operating in the culture? What are the different behaviors that we see operating in the culture? And then what are some different systems? And so it gives organizations a way to look at culture, their own culture, right, at 3 different levels, and they are going to validate whether those seem accurate and true to them. It's a very inclusive process.
And I've heard you say that there are some underlying cultural beliefs that people are not willing to talk about.
Well, they're not. Sometimes it's not that they're not willing; it's that they just don't even know they exist. So they can't. There's a lack of awareness, so they can't talk about it. But they usually will once they know the beliefs exist. For example, I was working in a school a couple of years ago, and we did this half-day assessment I'm mentioning, and at the end of it, one of the underlying beliefs that came up was that all conflict is bad. And if you'd asked anybody in the organization, in the school, if they thought conflict was bad, they wouldn't have said it was bad. It was a belief that the culture held that nobody actually was consciously aware of. So what was interesting about that is they were in constant conflict in their behavior. But it was in this very nice way where it sort of seeped out, and it seeped out in this tension and in these circular conversations, because the belief that conflict was bad didn't allow them to be able to just have not even a conflict, but a debate, an important debate about an important topic at the school. So that was an example of how the underlying belief was guiding the behavior. Once they popped it up to the surface and said, oh, wow, we really think we have a belief that conflict is bad. Look what that's doing to how we handle conflict. They were able to make better decisions about how they wanted to handle conflict going forward.
It almost sounds like passive-aggressive behavior.
Oh, in that sense? Yeah. Some of it was, but they didn't. It was interesting that they just didn't know why. You know what I mean? They didn't know. It was a great example of culture in action. They didn't know why they were doing what they were doing. And they'd done it that way for so long, it was just ingrained.
It's funny because I've seen this kind of show up from time to time, and that this brings it up. It's these two little fish are swimming along, and the big fish comes by and says, "How's the water?" And the two little fish look at each other and go, "What's water?"
Right.
Because
exactly.
You're just so ingrained in it, you don't even realize that that's kind of what's all around you.
Yeah, you're immersed. Literally, you're immersed.
You're literally immersed. So I know in your book you talked about Google, and they studied their teams and they came up with 5 key characteristics of, I guess they were successful teams. Is that correct?
Yes.
So what were those, and can you share them?
Absolutely. I mean, one was the psychological safety that I mentioned. They found that was a huge, huge factor of their success. Another was dependability. Right? So just that we're going to get things done on time. We'll meet expectations, right? I can count on you to do that. That there was structure and clarity. So we have well-defined roles. We know what we're going toward. We have direction and purpose. That their work had meaning. So it meant, I'm invested in my work. It has significance to me. I'm not spending my time doing something that I, don't like or I think is really boring or meaningless, right? There's meaning in my work. And then impact. So meaning that, a belief that the work they're doing impacts the greater good, right? I'm not just a cog in a wheel here. There's something important that I'm able to contribute through my day-to-day work.
And I think that's a big shift, because if you look back through history, especially if you look at factory work, you literally were kind of a cog in the wheel, and that's what they wanted. And It seems a lot of large corporations tend to want that. They need the ability to essentially swap people in and out. But it seems like companies are changing today to say that's not going to allow. At least certain companies are changing to say that's not going to allow us to grow and to be productive going forward. It's going to kind of prevent that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. And it's one thing I find is that there's really there's such a spectrum right now of how companies are viewing culture and operating within it, meaning there are the Googles, right, and other companies that are in the news, and then all the great companies that we've never heard of, right, that have amazing cultures. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are companies that don't, if I ask them what culture was, or you ask them what culture was, they really wouldn't have an answer. It's not even something on their radar screen, and they don't value it as important. And then we have everybody in the middle. So it's really a spectrum.
So that kind of brings up a question is, does culture come at the expense of profit?
I don't think so at all. No. In fact, I think if you are not paying attention to your culture, you are, at the end of the day, your profits, you may have great profits, right? But you don't have the profits that you could have. Case in point is a manufacturing company I've been working with. And at the time that I was brought in, their profits were great. But their culture, so the cultural issues and other issues hadn't hit the bottom line yet, but it would have about 6 months to a year later, because the writing was really on the wall. But their culture was really in decline. They were having their folks in production in manufacturing were really having a hard time with the increased sales volume. They did not have an ability to adapt to this change, even though it was a good change, right? And so they would have hit their profits pretty quickly if they hadn't done something to take a look at everything. So what I see is that when you have an organization where people trust each other, they can solve problems, they can work together effectively overall, they can be strategic, they can be innovative, whatever is needed in the role or in the organization, then you're only going to increase everything your company's supposed to be doing profit-wise.
And I think that's very true. We'll be back with Claudette in a minute. Speaking of profit, do you focus on the numbers in your business or life? Do you know what the spread is between the money coming in and the money going out? It's called profit. The wider the margin, the happier people are. The more freedom to do what you want, how you want, when you want. The more to invest in improving yourself and your business. When there is no profit, we have problems. And like she said, if you're not tracking the decline, sometimes it may come as a surprise to you. I help small business owners focus on the profit numbers. I know for some of you it's worse than a root canal, but I help to make sure you don't feel a thing and you have the profit to enjoy the fruits of your business. Because I work virtually, it's amazingly affordable for small business owners to have high-powered financial focus of an expert without the expense. Email me and let's see if I can help you. Focus on your profits in your business. It's Rocky@richersoul.com. Now, let's get back to our amazing conversation with Claudette. So, what happens if you work for a company and you're not in a leadership role or you're not in a place where you have the ability to bring about a massive shift in culture? How do you, in your part of the organization, bring about change?
Yeah, and I get this question a lot. It's such an important one. I think a couple of different things come to mind. One is that if you're on a team, in a department, in a work group, whatever, you have the opportunity to change the culture of that entity for sure. Right. So you can make an influence there. You can make a difference there and influence that. Another is sometimes I'll encourage people to become what I mentioned earlier, cultural detectives. So anybody in an organization at any level can do this, where you literally spend some time, like, when you're in a meeting, when you're in the middle of your work, depending on what you do, you're with a customer, whatever the case may be, you just observe, right? You set your mind's eye in a way to observing. If I were outside of this meeting looking in, right? If I was a fly on the wall, what would I really notice about how people are interacting and behaving? What would I notice about how things are getting done or not? What would I notice about the vibe or the energy in here? And instead of making assumptions about the culture, which we all sometimes do, the culture is this or the culture is that, really step back and be objective about it and start noticing any patterns. And then sometimes, depending on the situation you're in, you can actually, you can go to your manager, you can go to a leader in the organization and say, I don't know if you're aware, but, we have this kind of meeting, or we have this pattern of behavior that happens in the organization. And if we shifted this, we might be able to make a big change, right? As you were saying earlier, sometimes those small changes make a big difference. So I've seen people successfully do that because it's such a diplomatic and committed way to look at an organization and then bring some key information to someone who might be able to do something about it.
And I think that's a big skill. I think people have trouble just sitting and listening and actually being present and listening and not thinking about what are they going to say next, or what's my iPhone got going on, or what's happening later tonight, but to actually sit, be present, and observe the situation in an unbiased way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely takes skill. Absolutely. And I find that and listening. And I find that it's such a worthwhile skill to develop. And culture doesn't seem to tolerate shortcuts very well. So, it is a process because you're not only helping people change, but you're helping a whole system change. And I'll often say, sometimes I'll say, if I had written a book called, 3 quick steps to change your culture, right? Oh my God, I would have sold 1 million copies already. Because that's what everyone's looking for. It just doesn't change that way.
No, it's like everything in life. I mean, in some senses, it's easy, and the process isn't difficult, but actually doing it is hard work.
Right. Yeah, exactly. There are just aspects of it that are really hard work.
And you have to do the hard work. Regardless,
you can't skip that part, right?
No, you can't skip that part. And so I guess that kind of leads into emotional intelligence. And I think that's becoming much more of an awareness in the workplace. And it seems like there is much more of a focus there. I think you talk about it a little bit in your book as well, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, emotional intelligence, trust, psychological safety, truth telling. I think it's, in some ways in some companies at least, not in all, but we're expecting a different level of interaction, right? A higher level of interaction. That it's this idea of office politics, right? Oh, gossip's just part of it. Backstabbing's just part of it, right? Trying to get ahead and step on people and all that's just part of it. I think there's a move away from that into, and let's have a better way of operating. I mean, really, who wants to actually be in that environment, right? When you really think about it. And wouldn't it be nice if we could be in something that was more functional, more satisfying, where we could get more done and really be more of ourselves at work, bring more of ourselves to work.
And I guess that takes time and space. And that's one of the struggles. And I think we talked about that earlier. When you're constantly in that putting out fires mode, you don't have the ability to have these deeper conversations and to fix the underlying problems and make sure that there aren't fires every day going on.
Exactly. And you also don't have a chance to say, our expectation is this, right? Our expectation of behavior, speaking of emotional intelligence, is this in our organization. And, you can stay or you can go, right? Whatever you want to do is the right choice for you. But really, we have a standard here. And I think often that those standards of behavior, or whatever an organization would want to call them, aren't stated well enough. And so anything goes. Or we tolerate people, we put up with them because they are, great salesperson. This person's a rainmaker. This person does this. This person, the customer loves this person. And so we tolerate this range of behavior that's not very functional, that actually damages the overall functioning of the organization.
And we talked about that earlier, how one person or one area can have a ripple effect throughout the entire organization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In fact,
And you talked a little bit in your book about heart convos, and you also mentioned energy convos. So what does an energy convo look like?
Yeah, thank you. No one ever asked me about that, so I'm so excited to get to talk about that. Yeah, so an energy conversation. So this was something I put together around how do you assess if the cultural changes you made as an overall organization have worked, right? And how do you keep them going? How do you really keep those changes going and start to notice when you might need to make another round of shifts or changes that don't need to be dramatic or huge, but it's a tune-up, right? It's looking at what needs to shift and change. So the energy conversation is around noticing the bigger picture of, what if, let's say you're in a team meeting, right? And you decide to have an energy conversation, you're looking at things like, what's the energy like in the room right now, right? Is it tense? Is it relaxed? Are we having a good time? Are we all stressed out? What's going on? And then actually noticing, what have we been observing? What have we even been sensing or feeling and not even knowing why in the organization or on our team, right? I was with a client just yesterday, actually just today, earlier today. And all of a sudden, seemingly, right, out of nowhere, again, seemingly, these things usually build up over time. Some things that had been working really well in the organization have hit a speed bump, right? And, so we started to really have more of an energy conversation about, okay, what do we know about this? What have you been observing? What's the energy around this? What are you guys noticing? What do you think might be emerging or changing, as a way to start to understand why the speed bump happened and what is it telling us about what needs to shift or change? So it's the energy conversations, a more of a global conversation, I would say, versus global meaning global in the organization, versus that more of that analytical, okay, what's the data? What went wrong here? Which is real. I think focusing on data is very important, right, as part of the picture. But this takes us out of the data and out of our analytical minds into another part of a conversation, out of our heads into a different kind of conversation about energy, which is present in every organization and almost always never talked about.
And so kind of leading on to that, then what does the heart convo look like?
Yeah, the heart is really about learning and about tuning into more of that, certainly the emotional intelligence, like we were just talking about, but also looking at how do we, what do we need to listen to? What are we curious about, right? What's our level of trust right now? Do we have relationships in the organization that need some attention? And the reason we're doing this is, these conversations are certainly part of problem solving sometimes, not always. The heart conversation is also a great opportunity to say, okay, what are our mindsets right now? Right, coming back to the theme of mindset we've been touching on. What are our mindsets right now? What are the behaviors we've been noticing? And so this is really connecting folks, certainly beyond energy, to, I would say, the emotional culture of the organization or their team, right? Or it could be two people having this conversation and making sure they're accessing all the information, because our information, as we know, is not just through data, it's also through energy, and it's certainly also through emotion.
And I think a lot of times we just don't have the conversations. We're all just told, this is work, do your job, stifle it, and move on.
Right, exactly. Right.
And so you bring about change, and it's almost, how do you create that culture that embraces and then demands constant change and improvement?
Yeah, it's interesting. What I find is when an organization gets going in this process, they end up, in a way, they don't even need to demand the change because it just happens, the way life is, right? Things start happening. And I don't mean it's some changes are outside of our control, of course, right? And others we can anticipate or we activate on our own. But part of it has to do with really this process, the second phase of my process. The first is authenticity, or the assessment phase. And the second phase is design. And so when we're creating a cultural design, and it's not something I'm doing, right? I'm facilitating that process with the organization. So we have a lot of buy-in, we have a lot of insight and input and enthusiasm for what's happening. As we're designing the cultural change, or we're designing maybe we're focusing on particular aspects of the culture, depending on what came up out of the assessment, we're designing it so that it can adapt to change, right? So that it can understand and start to anticipate what changes might be approaching it, that it can respond and react differently, and use change as almost in a way a form of fuel, in the sense of wow, there's a change coming. What do we need to do? How is this an opportunity for us? Is there a way we want to innovate, right? When you're into opportunity and possibility and innovation, and you make that practical and pragmatic, it becomes really amazing what you'll see an organization create.
And so you're literally putting change into a very positive light of the future, instead of, I think a lot of times people look at change as a negative. They don't want to. And so you've kind of flipped that whole switch.
Yeah, exactly. It is about flipping that switch because it's inevitable anyway, right? It's going to happen. And when a culture gets very change resistant or stuck, which I have seen, that is a real, and I've helped those cultures, move forward, but that's a real challenge, right? Because you have a lot of stuck energy in the culture itself, right? You have people who really aren't interested in looking at things, going to mindset, looking at things differently. So we want to turn change on its head and make it a form of opportunity and possibility, because then it's almost like the options are endless in a way, within the context of your field, right, or your environment. But you can really activate much more in an individual and systemic level than you could before.
That's very true. I'm guessing you don't deal with a lot of government organizations, do you?
Oh, no.
That's a whole different culture.
That's a whole different culture, right? No, I don't deal with a lot of government. I have done some consulting in government organizations, but usually it's companies. Yes.
Everyone's got blind spots, and I'm sure that companies have blind spots as well. How do you bring about and shine the light on the blind spots?
Yeah, companies have blind spots. Leaders often will have blind spots because, no one person can see everything, right? We all have blind spots. And I'll highlight the leaders a little more, just because as we know, their blind spots often are magnified throughout the company, right? They have more of an impact. But the organizational blind spots, in my role as the luxury of being the outsider, right, is the power to observe with is, in an unbiased a way as a human being can have, perspective a human being can have. And so through that, I'm often over time able to notice the blind spots. Like a common one that's coming to mind because of the client I was with this morning is balancing the work that needs to get done with certain kinds of meetings. And now most organizations are dealing with like, we're in meetings all day, so we do our real work from 5 to 7, and it stresses everybody out, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the meetings that are about learning to do something differently, right? Learning a new skill, learning a new process, solving problems differently. So the meetings we're having there are much more, they're not just sit around and suffer through the meeting. They're really they're very active problems that require everybody's input. Active meetings, that require everybody's input. So from that perspective, it's in their case, how do you balance, right? How do you balance meetings with getting the work done? And they have a bit of a blind spot sometimes in thinking the most important thing is getting the work done. And I have to say, well, it is really important. And if you don't get better at doing some of these other things like strategic problem solving or dealing with, bottlenecks in your process that have plagued you for a decade, all this will just continue. And you don't want that. You want this to change and improve. So that's a blind spot, for example, I've been helping them through to see the value of working on the larger issues.
And that's true. If you're stuck in the constant motion of the work and a lot of it is repetitive and so forth, if you're not taking the time to build the systems and to put them in place, and it takes the time to build the system, but if you do that, that effort and work up front saves you a tremendous amount of time on the other side once it's all done.
Absolutely.
And I think today companies need to be much more worried about culture and how they project themselves, because nowadays there is a lot more information on the internet. So if somebody wants to look at a company and say, do I want to work for them? They can go to Glassdoor or they can go to LinkedIn and they can actually research the culture of an organization and see how people there behave and how they're treated. And then you have the choice to say yes or no. I'm not, if someone or some place is toxic because it will light up on those websites and make it quite clear.
It will. And it's so, the whole reputation issue is big, isn't it? What's on Glassdoor, what's available, what happens when there's a really negative article about an organization that ends up being, especially if it's related to culture or the leader. And so I think organizations, they didn't have that anonymity. They used to, especially smaller organizations. Now there's so much information available. It's an interesting way of holding companies accountable that we never used to have. Yeah.
And that's the other thing is, do they even bother to look to see how they are representative in the world and what people say about them? And are they willing to hear it? Because they might see it and they might blame it on a disgruntled employee versus opening up and saying, is this true? And is it real? Or are we ignoring something?
Right. And that's the great question, isn't it? Let's consider and reflect on whether this could even be true or real. And if it is, what are we to do about it? And what can we learn from this? It reminded me of sometimes when I'm working in organizations and I'm working with a leader, and there's a pattern I've noticed with some, not all leaders by any means, but some, where they'll say, I'll bring something up and they'll say, well, it shouldn't be that way. It should be this way. And we'll have a conversation about what I call the should be different mindset, which is I'm sure that it should be different. And it is, in fact, not different, right? And dealing with reality is actually much more efficient in the long run than continuing to talk about how people should be doing things differently if they're actually not doing things differently. And I'll notice that, when you were talking about, if someone gets a comment on Glassdoor that's not so great, are they willing to entertain the possibility that it could be legitimate or have even a kernel of truth that could be helpful? It's moving outside of this idea that things should be different than they are and really looking at reality. And it's really transformational when a leader in a company starts being willing to do that.
And that applies to us personally. We also need to do that within our own lives and within our own families and within the cultures around us.
We do. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is there anything else you wanted to share on the subject of cultural brilliance but didn't get a chance to?
Thanks for asking. I think the last thing I'll share on that point is I really believe that cultures can be brilliant, which of course I wouldn't have written the book if I didn't, right? But I think there's so much potential in almost all of our cultures, if not all of them. And if we could bring that to the surface, if we can really use it and help people bring out the best in what they want to contribute to a particular company, we change that organization. And I think as organizations shift their cultures positively one by one, we're going to be making a very different and positive impact on the world. So I think this is the cultural conversation is important, not just for how companies operate, which is important, and the bottom line, which is certainly important, but also our larger impact on our world, on our society. I think there's a lot of opportunity here.
And I think that's very true. And building trust, and people have the ability now to make choices, to say yes or no. It's no longer one supplier for a particular product. You have the ability to pick and choose. And as people have much more availability of information, they get to make their own choices of what kind of culture do I want to do business with.
Absolutely. They really do. So we are in a time of great possibility. And as you said, opportunity and choice.
So based on our conversation, what's one action step people can take this week to move forward?
I think it's really being a cultural detective, right? Even though, as you said, that listening without bias can be challenging. At your next meeting, sit down and listen differently, as opposed to, oh, there's Jim going on and on again, right? Things we all think sometimes. Really listen to Jim, right? So even something like that, I think an act of change, even listening differently and noticing differently can be an act of change, because it takes our blinders off and opens us up to new ways of thinking and new mindsets.
And I think that's an excellent suggestion. And all of these suggestions that usually come about, they have pretty much zero risk and zero cost, right, other than just a little bit of your time. So I always encourage people, get out of your current patterns and try something new.
Definitely.
It's time to learn the secrets of life. What's your secret to living a brilliant life?
Being true to myself and really trusting myself, trusting my gut. Those would be the two things I would say. As long as I stay true to myself and I really trust myself, very positive things happen.
And that's not always easy to do.
Thank you. No, it is not always easy to do.
It's hard to look in that mirror and be true to ourselves. I think too often we don't want to face that.
Or you do, and you realize I have a really hard choice to make, right? I may really disappoint someone else, things like that.
And then I guess it's a choice of, do you want to disappoint yourself or someone else?
Exactly. Yeah. Then you have to decide what you're going to do from there.
What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
Along the same lines, really trusting my intuition, trusting my gut. When I looked back on my childhood, interestingly, I had a lot of intuition. I didn't know what it was, right? I was not taught to trust myself. So it really went dormant. And when I started to rediscover it, I was like, oh my gosh, I was born with a lot of intuition that has served me very, very, very well, that ability to listen to myself in that way. So I wish I had been connected to it sooner.
And that's a wonderful gift. And unfortunately, there's no class on intuition, is there?
No. Not when you're a kid, right?
Not when you're a kid. What's one piece of advice you would give to your younger self?
Not to be repetitive, but trust myself comes up. And knowing that following your own path is challenging, as we've alluded to, right? It will always, always be worth it, at least for me, right? It will always, always be worth it. Following your own path, listening to yourself and really trusting yourself, even if there are times of real strife or challenge or pain, it's always going to work out okay.
And most things in life do. They always seem to work out.
They do.
There's that great saying, and this too shall pass, whether it's good times or bad times, this too shall pass. If people would like to find you and connect and learn more about your book, what is the best way for them to do that?
Thanks. My website is culturalbrilliance.com. And you can find out more about me. I also have a resource page. So different resources, articles. I have a product I really like that is a complimentary resource, which is a cultural assessment guide, a set of exercises that people can download and take and use in their organization. And the book is on the website. Contacting me is also on the website. You can also get the book directly from Amazon.
And we'll put all of that in the show notes and have them for people. And I guess at the end, people have a choice. You can create your culture or someone else will create your culture. So I encourage people to be proactive and do it themselves. I thank you so much for being here today. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed the conversation with Claudette and also reading the book. The reality is culture happens, with or without you. You have to be intentional to be part of it and create the culture you want. It's so easy to say, it's not my problem or job, which is fine. But that's the culture you just created for you and those around you. This week's action step, be a cultural detective. You can do this at work, in your business, or at home. It costs you nothing and can change your entire focus with the people around you. Remember to be quiet and observe, and don't put your judgment onto the situation. Just ask yourself, why did that occur? Why did someone behave that way? Why are things the way they are? Just observe. The links to Claudette's work are in the show notes. Check them out. I'm glad to see there's a change in the way companies look at culture and that it's becoming far more positive. Don't be like Blockbuster or Western Union or so many other companies that refused to change and got left behind. If you're still listening, you must have liked this episode, so please share it with a few friends. It can start a great conversation, and I would appreciate that. You can also connect with me on Facebook. There's both a Facebook page and a Facebook group for Richer Soul. What's preventing you from moving forward, and who are you putting on your team to help build the life you deserve? Taking no action creates a far worse outcome in life than trying something and failing. Can I help you achieve your goals and create an amazing life? Just email me, and we can start with a short chat to see if we're a good fit. For many people, one call allows them to take a giant leap forward towards their dreams. You can always get me at rocky@richersoul.com. I'd love to hear how you're doing, and the information I've shared has helped. Thanks for listening. Have an abundant week.